When Japanese lookouts scanned the horizon in early 1943, what they claimed to see defied all logic. A sea dotted with carriers, dozens of flight decks where only a handful should exist. Whispered reports made their way back to Tokyo. Perhaps the Americans had built not 20, not 50, but 200 carriers. It sounded impossible. Yet the illusion was so convincing, even seasoned officers began to believe it. This was not just a mistake in counting. It was the result of a forgotten battle, a calculated deception, and a war of shadows that would break Japan's confidence long before its fleet was destroyed. The Japanese Navy had prided itself on reconnaissance. Before Pearl Harbor, its scouts had mapped enemy harbors, tracked convoys, and identified targets with precision. But by 1943, cracks had begun to appear. The Pacific was vast, communications delayed, and American tactics had shifted into something unpredictable. U.S. commanders knew Japan relied on its eyes in the sky, so they turned those eyes against them. Every flat-topped vessel, whether an escort carrier, a converted merchant ship, or even a cleverly disguised transport, was paraded across the ocean like bait. To a pilot high above, speed and profile meant everything. And when those profiles multiplied, so too did Japan's estimates of American power. The first shock came during a series of clashes around the Solomon Islands. Japanese aircraft had been dispatched to strike what intelligence described as a modest carrier group. What the pilots found was staggering. At least a dozen flat-decked ships bristling with planes. Bombers rushed in, desperate to strike. Anti-aircraft fire tore the skies apart. A few hits were scored, but as the Japanese broke off, one pilot radioed back, "There are too many, more carriers than we imagined." His words became gospel once the after-action reports reached headquarters. Commanders struggled to reconcile the impossible math. America could not have produced this many ships so quickly. But the eyewitness account seemed undeniable. The Americans had used a trick. Small escort carriers, often just 10,000 tons, carrying a fraction of the aircraft of a true fleet carrier, were grouped in ways that magnified their presence. Some were deliberately split across different sectors, creating the illusion of multiple task forces. Decoys sailed with false radio chatter, broadcasting the call signs of non-existent carrier groups. Japanese cryptographers intercepted messages suggesting massive fleets converging on the same region. They didn't know many of those signals were deliberate forgeries. What Tokyo saw was an empire of carriers encircling them. For Japanese naval doctrine, which depended on seeking a decisive battle against what they believed was a limited U.S. fleet, this illusion was catastrophic. Before, they had imagined facing a handful of American carriers, 6, maybe 8 at most. They had built their war plans around it. But if the U.S. had truly leapt to 100 or even 200, then the decisive battle was already lost before it began. Pilots returning from missions swore they had seen endless American decks stretching across the sea. Officers debated whether the reports were exaggerated, but the sheer consistency of the sightings broke down their skepticism. If every patrol claimed the same thing, could they all be wrong? The forgotten battle that fed this panic was not won with guns, but with shadows. The Americans knew they didn't need to sink every Japanese ship. They only needed to convince Japan that any strike would meet overwhelming resistance. In those critical months, the deception worked so well that Japanese admirals hesitated, delaying offensives that might have inflicted real damage. Instead of pouncing, they paused. Instead of trusting their instincts, they drowned in fear of phantom fleets. But the greatest irony was this. At the very moment Japan believed the U.S. had 200 carriers, the actual number of true fleet carriers was still in the single digits. America's shipyards were racing, yes, but they had not yet delivered the massive armada that would come in 1944. The Japanese had been fooled by their own eyes, and once doubt seeped in, it never left. Every horizon shimmered with the possibility of another fleet. Every radar blip, every shadow of a convoy seemed like proof of American abundance. This was only the beginning. The myth of the 200 carriers spread like wildfire, shaping strategy, clouding judgment, and convincing a once confident empire that it faced an enemy too vast to defeat. And in that fear, Japan began to unravel, not by torpedoes or bombs, but by the crushing weight of an illusion they could not escape. The panic spread faster than any carrier task force ever could. In Tokyo, the Naval General Staff pored over reports with grim faces. Maps of the Pacific, once marked with confident arrows of attack, now bristled with question marks. Every scout's logbook seemed to confirm the same nightmare. The Americans were everywhere at once. Senior admirals, who had built their entire doctrine on the principle of striking a numerically inferior fleet, now asked the same unthinkable question: what if the US Navy was already too vast to challenge? The forgotten battle fueling this hysteria was not one clash, but a series of carefully orchestrated feints. American commanders knew they could not match Japan in experience, so they chose misdirection as their weapon. Escort carriers, originally built to protect convoys, were pushed forward into contested waters. Their small air groups flew patrols and strikes as if they were part of a grand fleet. Meanwhile, false radio traffic filled the ether with chatter of phantom task forces. Japanese code breakers, once so confident after early war successes, suddenly found themselves decoding signals that suggested an impossible truth: that the US could conjure new carrier groups overnight. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea in March 1943 gave the illusion its sharpest teeth. Japan's attempt to reinforce its garrisons by sea ended in catastrophe when Allied aircraft shredded the convoy. To the Japanese survivors, it seemed as though swarms of planes had risen from carriers hidden just beyond the horizon. In reality, the devastation came largely from land-based bombers. But rumor distorted fact. By the time survivors reported back, the story had already hardened. America had unleashed a fleet of carriers to annihilate them. Tokyo did not challenge the reports. Instead, it accepted them, feeding the belief that the Pacific was now crawling with flat-topped predators. For frontline pilots, the illusion was terrifying. Many had trained under the doctrine of Kantai Kessen, the decisive battle in which Japan's superior skill would offset America's industrial might. But when they launched missions in mid-1943, they found themselves facing anti-aircraft fire and fighters from unexpected directions. Squadrons would strike what they believed was a lone carrier group, only to encounter another deck launching planes 100 miles away. Pilots returned to base shaken, insisting they had stumbled into a force far larger than anyone imagined. Some described skies so thick with American aircraft that it seemed like the ocean itself was spawning them. American commanders encouraged these impressions. They cycled carriers in and out of forward waters so that the same ships appeared multiple times in different locations. Escort carriers, with their smaller profiles, were given escorts that made them seem grander. Even simple tricks, like spreading task forces along a horizon, gave the illusion of endless decks. At night, lights were deliberately spaced in patterns that mimicked carrier formations. From a distant scout's perspective, each glow on the horizon became another phantom flat top. Back in Tokyo, the overestimation became doctrine. Internal memos began to speak of the Americans as if they possessed between 150 and 200 carriers. The numbers were absurd, yet fear silenced doubt. For every cautious officer who raised questions, another reminded them of the pilot reports, the intercepted signals, the disastrous battles that seemed to prove the carrier's presence. It was easier to believe in a nightmare than to admit their intelligence had failed. The shift in strategy was immediate. Japan, once eager to gamble on aggressive strikes, grew hesitant. Convoys were rerouted, attacks postponed, and opportunities slipped away. In one instance, a Japanese task force considered attacking a US group near the Solomons, but withdrew after scouts claimed they faced overwhelming numbers. The truth? Only 2 American carriers had been present. The deception had already paralyzed initiative. This fear did not only alter battles, it altered minds. Sailors spoke of the phantom fleets, endless waves of American carriers conjured out of shipyards that seemed more like factories of magic than steel. In mess halls and ready rooms, rumors outpaced reality. The US, they whispered, had found a way to multiply carriers faster than Japan could sink them. The legend of 200 carriers was born not from fact but from repetition. Each time a pilot exaggerated, each time a commander erred on the side of caution, the myth grew. What made this illusion so powerful was timing. America was indeed accelerating production. Shipyards on both coasts worked day and night, launching escort carriers and light carriers with unprecedented speed. While Japan struggled to replace even a single lost fleet carrier, the U.S. was commissioning new hulls monthly. In the fog of war, it was almost believable that America had achieved the impossible. And when the myth seemed believable, it became as dangerous as any fleet of steel. By the end of 1943, Japanese naval planners were no longer debating if the U.S. had the numbers. They were debating how many. Some believed 80, others swore it was 150, a few insisted it was 200. The truth that the US had fewer than a dozen true fleet carriers was buried beneath layers of fear, rumor, and illusion. And in that fog, Japan's confidence began to fracture. The forgotten battle was not one of ships sunk or islands captured. It was the battle for perception, and Japan was losing it. Every time they looked across the ocean, they saw an enemy too large to fight. And in believing it, they made it true. The fear that America's fleet had multiplied beyond reason grew heavier with each passing month. By early 1944, the illusion was no longer just rumor. It had become accepted truth inside Japan's war rooms. Officers no longer asked if America had achieved numerical superiority. They asked how much. Some believed the US possessed 100 carriers. Others whispered 200. In reality, the United States had fewer than a dozen fleet carriers, bolstered by light and escort carriers. But to Japan, every flat deck was another nightmare given form. The seeds of this miscalculation had been planted long before. Escort carriers, designed originally to shepherd convoys, were never meant to shape the balance of naval power. They carried perhaps 24 planes, often slow Wildcats or Avengers, compared to the 90 aircraft aboard a full carrier like Enterprise or Shokaku. Yet grouped together, they looked formidable. And when viewed through the lens of exhaustion, fear, and distance, they became indistinguishable from their larger cousins. American commanders exploited this ruthlessly. They spread these ships across theaters, rotated them rapidly, and flooded the airwaves with chatter, suggesting fleets where none existed. At the Battle of the Gilberts and Marshalls, this deception reached a crescendo. Japanese scouts reported waves of aircraft rising from the sea, more than any single fleet could carry. They assumed multiple carrier divisions were converging. In truth, small groups of escort carriers were supporting landings and ferrying aircraft to forward bases. The effect, however, was devastating. Japanese commanders concluded that America had surged past industrial limits and produced carriers faster than steel itself could be forged. Inside Tokyo, strategy unraveled. Japanese doctrine had always been rooted in Kantai-Kessen, the decisive clash of fleets where superior training and discipline would decide the war. But if the Americans truly commanded 100 carriers or more, then that doctrine was meaningless. How could even the bravest aviators strike when every attack might be met by endless decks launching endless planes? The confidence that had carried Japan through Pearl Harbor, through the Indian Ocean, through the early blitz of conquest, began to erode. Fear replaced daring. Doubt replaced aggression. Yet the irony was cruel. While Japan feared an enemy too numerous to fight, the reality was that they still held local superiority in several engagements. There were moments when Japan's surviving carriers, combined with land-based air, outnumbered the actual American carriers present. But hesitation cost them dearly. Japanese admirals pulled back when they might have struck. Convoys went unprotected. Garrison troops waited for supplies that never arrived. Each decision was warped by the ghost of phantom carriers that never existed. For the Americans, this psychological edge was priceless. They knew they were still building toward true numerical dominance. They knew their fleet was not yet invincible. But if Japan believed it was, then half the battle was already won. Roosevelt's promise that America would become the arsenal of democracy was not just rhetoric. It was turning into a weapon of the mind. The mere expectation of overwhelming power paralyzed the enemy before that power was even fully realized. Meanwhile, American shipyards worked without pause. Liberty ships slid down the ways by the hundreds. Destroyer escorts patrolled every ocean lane, and carriers, fleet, light, and escort emerged at a pace the world had never seen. By 1944, the illusion was merging with reality. Where once there had been only a handful of decks, there were now dozens. The Japanese, who had feared 200, suddenly realized the impossible was no longer unthinkable. But the most striking consequence was not material, it was doctrinal. Japanese strategy shifted from seeking battle to avoiding it. Once confident in their ability to lure the Americans into traps, they now clung to defense, stretching their fleets thin to guard against phantoms. This doctrinal shift, born from fear of a fleet that did not exist, weakened Japan far more than bombs ever could. The forgotten battle was no single clash. It was the slow, invisible war of perception, a campaign fought in the minds of admirals as much as in the waves of the Pacific. And as 1944 bled into 1945, Japan stood at the edge of ruin, not only because of what America had built, but because of what Japan had convinced itself America had already built. By mid-1944, the illusion had fused with reality. Japan had once whispered about America possessing 200 carriers. Now for the first time, the rumor no longer sounded like fantasy. American shipyards had unleashed a tide of steel. Fleet carriers, light carriers, and escort carriers poured into the Pacific, one after another. Where once Japanese scouts had miscounted, now their eyes were truly overwhelmed. The Pacific was no longer dotted with phantom fleets, it was crawling with real ones. The Battle of the Philippine Sea was the moment illusion became nightmare. Japanese pilots, already undertrained and underfueled, rose to meet what they thought was one carrier task force. Instead, they faced a wall of American flight decks stretching from horizon to horizon. The sky filled with Hellcats, Avengers, and Dauntlesses, so many that one pilot swore it was as if the sea itself had grown wings. Attacks broke apart, formations dissolved, and the great carrier duel that Japan had always prepared for ended in slaughter. More than 300 Japanese planes were destroyed in a single day. Survivors returned to bases where officers asked the same desperate question: how many carriers did America send? No one could give a number. Estimates ranged from 50 to 100. The truth hardly mattered. What mattered was that Japan no longer believed victory possible. In Tokyo, doctrine itself was collapsing. The vision of Kantai-Kessen, the decisive battle that would break the enemy, was abandoned in practice, if not in name. Japan no longer sought confrontation, it sought survival. Defensive lines were stretched thin across islands, each garrison waiting for relief that would never come. Naval forces were scattered, parceled out piecemeal, because commanders believed they faced a Leviathan fleet. And when they finally gathered their strength for Leyte Gulf, it was too late. At Leyte, Japan tried to gamble everything. Carriers were thrown forward as bait, their decks nearly empty of planes. Battleships charged into the Gulf, hoping to smash transports before the Phantom Fleet could react. For a moment, success seemed possible. American forces were caught off guard, but hesitation returned, born from the same fear that had stalked them for years. Japanese admirals withdrew when victory was within their grasp. Why? Because scouts once again reported more American carriers rushing to the scene. In reality, the bait had worked. The US still held the advantage, but not as overwhelming as Japan believed. Yet perception dictated action, and action dictated defeat. By now, the myth of 200 carriers had eaten into every decision. Pilots whispered it, sailors feared it, officers planned around it. America no longer needed to convince Japan with tricks or decoys. The enemy had convinced itself. And when the truth finally aligned with the myth, it was crushing. By 1945, the United States Navy truly commanded over 100 carriers of every type. The dream that had once terrified Japan into hesitation was now flesh and steel, roaring across the Pacific like a storm. But here lies the twist. The forgotten battle was never about numbers. It was about time. America didn't need 200 carriers in 1943. It only needed Japan to believe it had them. That belief forced hesitation, squandered opportunities, and drained Japan's will to strike boldly when chances still remained. By the time Japan realized how many carriers America actually had, the war was already lost. In the end, it wasn't the myth that broke Japan. It was the way that myth reshaped their doctrine, their courage, their very perception of the fight. A nation that once sought a single decisive blow instead found itself shadowboxing against phantom fleets. And when the real fleets came, they were unstoppable. The story of the 200 carriers is not just about ships or battles. It's about how fear can become a weapon sharper than steel, how illusions can wound an enemy more deeply than bombs, and how a forgotten deception can tilt the balance of a world war. Japan did not fall only to American industry or firepower. It fell to a vision of power so vast it seemed divine, and as the empire crumbled, one lesson echoed across the waves. Sometimes the deadliest fleet is the one that exists only in the enemy's imagination.